Morning I walked out of Drumheller Institution. It was minus 18 degrees and the sky over the Alberta Badlands was the color of old bone. I remember thinking that was fitting somehow. Everything felt bleached out, used up. I stood at the gate with a garbage bag holding the same clothes I'd worn the day they brought me in. A plaid flannel shirt, dark jeans and work boots that still had dried mud on the soles from my backyard in Lethbridge, and I breathed in air so cold it made my lungs ache. 17 months of my life, gone. And my brother had put me there. I need to go back to the beginning because none of this makes sense without it. My name is Douglas. I'm 63 years old. For 31 years, I ran a mid-sized civil engineering consulting firm out of Lethbridge, Alberta. We did municipal infrastructure work mostly, drainage systems, road grading assessments, bridge load analyses for smaller towns across southern Alberta and into Saskatchewan. Nothing glamorous. But it was mine. I built it from a folding table in my basement, and by the time I was in my late 50s, it employed 22 people and had a solid regional reputation. My wife, Carol, passed away 8 years ago from pancreatic cancer. We had 2 boys. My older son, Miles, works up in Fort McMurray and we talk on the phone most Sundays. My younger son, Evan, married a woman named Tanya about 6 years ago, and somewhere between the wedding and the years that followed, I lost him to her. That's the only way I know how to say it. I lost him to her. Tanya is smart. That's the first thing you notice. Sharp in the way that makes you feel like she's always running calculations you can't see. She grew up outside of Calgary, had a business degree from the University of Calgary, and she knew how to present herself. In the early days, I liked her well enough. She was polished, she was motivated, and she seemed to make Evan happy. What I didn't understand for a long time was that Tanya's ambitions didn't stop at their household. About 4 years ago, Evan came to me with a proposal. He and Tanya wanted to invest in a commercial property development project in Okotoks, mixed-use retail and residential, the kind of thing that was booming in satellite communities around Calgary at the time. They said they had a private investor group but needed anchor capital to secure the land purchase. They asked me for $450,000. I said no. I was polite about it. I explained that I had my retirement savings structured a certain way, that I was planning to wind down the business in the next 3 years, and I needed that capital stable. I offered to sit down with them and look at their projections. I offered to connect them with a commercial lender I knew. They didn't want that. Evan barely spoke to me for 2 months afterward. Then, in February of that same year, Carol's estate finally cleared probate. There had been a small parcel of land she'd inherited from her parents, a quarter section out near Tabor that had been leased to a farming operation for decades. When the estate settled, that land was valued at just over $800,000. Under Carol's will, it was to be divided equally between me and our 2 sons. Miles and I proceeded through the executor process straightforwardly, but Evan, with Tanya advising him, began raising objections. He claimed there were verbal agreements Carol had made that changed the intended distribution. He produced a handwritten note, a single page, that he said Carol had written indicating she wanted him to receive a larger share to help him get established. I'd never seen that note before in my life. Miles hadn't either. We hired a lawyer in Lethbridge, a good one named, well, I'll call him my solicitor, because I'm not going to drag anyone into this who doesn't deserve it. My solicitor reviewed the note and had concerns about its authenticity. We commissioned a handwriting analysis through a certified document examiner in Edmonton. The examiner's preliminary findings were that the note showed inconsistencies with verified samples of Carol's handwriting, particularly in the pressure pattern and the way she formed her lowercase letters. That was in April. By June, everything had inverted. Evan and Tanya filed a complaint with the Law Society of Alberta, claiming my solicitor had engaged in improper conduct. That complaint went nowhere, but it bought them time. Then, in August, I received a visit from 2 RCMP officers at my office. They had a complaint filed against me for elder financial abuse, not against Carol's estate, against Evan. The allegation was that I had used my position as executor of the estate to redirect funds from a joint account that Evan and I had shared for business purposes, an account we'd opened years earlier when I briefly brought Evan into the firm to learn estimating, and that I had transferred money out of that account into personal accounts without his knowledge or consent. The amounts they cited totaled $280,000 over 14 months. I sat in my own office and listened to those officers, and I felt something I had never felt before in 61 years of life. It was not anger. It came later, the anger. What I felt in that moment was a kind of total stillness, like the world had just quietly swapped out its floor for air and I hadn't noticed yet. I had made no such transfers. What I did know, what I remembered, after the officers left and I sat alone in that office for 2 hours staring at the wall, was that Evans still had signing authority on that account. I'd never removed him. When he left the firm 4 years earlier, we had an awkward conversation about him taking a different career path. And I told him I'd handle the paperwork. And I never did. It was one of those things that stays on a list because updating it requires an uncomfortable interaction, and you keep putting it off. I put it off for 4 years. The RCMP investigation moved faster than I expected. Tanya had apparently compiled documentation, bank statements, a timeline, screenshots of some internal emails from the firm that I still don't fully understand how she accessed. My criminal lawyer, a woman I hired out of Calgary who had 20 years doing fraud defense, told me the documentation was organized in a way that suggested professional help. Someone who understood forensic accounting presentation had put this together. The bail hearing did not go well. The Crown argued flight risk, cited the amounts involved, cited my passport and a trip I'd made to Portugal the previous year, a vacation I'd taken with Miles and his family, my first trip to Europe, something Carol and I had always planned to do together and never got to. They painted it as evidence of international financial connections. I was granted bail, but the conditions were severe. I surrendered my passport. I had to report weekly to the RCMP detachment in Lethbridge. I could not contact Evan or Tanya directly. My firm, the business I had built over 3 decades, effectively collapsed in 8 weeks when word circulates in a small professional community that the principal is under criminal investigation. Contracts evaporate. I lost 2 municipal clients immediately. My senior project manager, a man I'd worked with for 19 years, called me with genuine grief in his voice and told me he had to find other employment. He had a mortgage and 3 kids. I told him I understood. I understood everything except how my son had done this. My criminal lawyer was thorough and she was honest with me. The digital evidence was the problem. The transfers appeared in the bank records. My name was on the account. My online banking credentials had been used, or credentials registered under my name had been used, to authorize the movements. Tanya had apparently opened a secondary online banking profile on the account at some point, something the bank's fraud team initially classified as a routine secondary access addition. My lawyer filed for forensic examination of the banking records, but was told we would need to retain our own expert, and the cost for a qualified digital forensics accountant in Calgary started at $35,000, with likely additional fees for court preparation. I had been paying criminal legal fees for 4 months by that point. My retirement savings were being drawn down in a way I had never anticipated. I could not access the estate funds because the estate was in a parallel civil dispute. I could not get $35,000 together for the forensics expert without liquidating the last of my non-registered investment account, which was also frozen pending the criminal proceedings. The preliminary hearing took 3 days. I sat in the provincial court in Lethbridge and watched Tanya testify. She was composed. She was articulate. She spoke about discovering the missing funds, about confronting Evan about it, about Evan being devastated and not wanting to believe it of his father. She cried once, briefly, and then collected herself. She was an excellent witness. I was convicted at trial 8 months later. Financial fraud over $5,000, breach of fiduciary duty. The judge sentenced me to 22 months less a day, which meant a provincial institution rather than federal. I sat in the courtroom, and my criminal lawyer put her hand on my arm, and the only thing I could think was, Carol would have known. Carol would have seen through Tanya the first time she walked through the door, and she would have said something quiet and particular to me that night. Something gentle but clear, and none of this would have happened. But Carol wasn't there, and I hadn't been paying attention. Drumheller Institution sits in the valley of the Red Deer River, surrounded by hoodoos and badlands and a landscape that looks like the surface of another planet. I arrived there in February. The intake process strips you of everything that made you a particular person in the outside world. They gave me a number, they gave me a schedule, they told me the rules. I was 61 years old, and I had never been in trouble with the law in my life. Not so much as a serious traffic violation. I had coached minor hockey for 11 years when my boys were young. I had served on the board of the Lethbridge Chamber of Commerce for 6 years. I had shoveled my neighbor's driveway every winter for a decade because she was 74 and had bad knees. None of that was visible in Drumheller. The first month was the hardest. I won't dress it up. I experienced things in that institution that I will carry with me for the rest of my life. I was not physically harmed, but the psychological weight of incarceration, the complete removal of autonomy, the noise, the constant vigilance you have to maintain, it does something to a person that doesn't fully reverse when you walk out the gate. What saved me, honestly, was a man I'll call Nelson. Nelson was 64 years old, a former electrician from Red Deer, who had been convicted of fraud related to an insurance scheme 6 years earlier. He was in the last 7 months of his sentence when I arrived. He had been in long enough to understand the rhythms of the place, and he had a calm about him that I found steadying when everything else felt like it was spinning. We played cribbage. That sounds small, but it wasn't. 3 or 4 evenings a week we played cribbage in the common room, and Nelson talked and I listened, and gradually I started talking back. He never told me what he thought I should feel about Evan. He never offered opinions about what I should do when I got out. He just kept showing up and laying down his cards and counting his pegs, and that consistency was something I held on to. He was released 4 months before me. We exchanged phone numbers, written on a piece of paper. He told me to call him when I got out, that he knew a good diner in Red Deer, and he'd buy me breakfast. I called him the day after I was released. We had breakfast. I ordered the full works, eggs, back bacon, home fries, rye toast, and I ate every bite, and it tasted like the best meal of my life, which it wasn't, but it felt that way. I'm telling you about Nelson because the video about someone else's story that I watched once, the one that made me decide to finally record my own, didn't mention the person who helped its subject in prison. That absence bothered me. The people who steady you in the worst moments of your life deserve to be named or at least acknowledged. Nelson steadied me. I owe him that. While I was incarcerated, Miles had not been idle. My older son is not a dramatic person. He doesn't make speeches. He doesn't send long emails full of feeling. He is methodical and private. And when he decides to do something, he does it without announcement. When I went into Drumheller, Miles quietly hired a civil litigation lawyer in Calgary, a different firm than anyone we'd used before, and began a parallel process to contest the authenticity of the handwritten note Evan had produced during the estate dispute. Miles also did something I hadn't been able to afford. He hired the forensic document examiner himself, retained separately from my criminal proceedings, to produce a full report on the handwriting evidence. And he hired a digital forensics accountant to examine the banking records for the period in question. He paid for this out of his own pocket. He never told me the total, and I've never asked, because I know that whatever it was most of what he had saved. The digital forensics accountant found it in the banking metadata. The secondary access profile that Tanya had added to the joint account, the one the bank had classified as routine, had been created using a device registered to an IP address connected to a Calgary business address, not my home address in Lethbridge, not my firm's address. A business address in Inglewood, Calgary, that turned out to be associated with the numbered company Tanya had registered 3 years earlier. The transfers themselves had been initiated from that same device on 17 of the 23 occasions. On the remaining 6 occasions, they were initiated from a mobile device, different from any phone registered to me. My own banking credentials had never been used to authorize those transfers. Someone had been using the secondary access profile Tanya had created from her own devices to move money out of an account that had my name on it. The report was 47 pages long. Miles brought a printed copy to my criminal lawyer, and she brought it to the Crown's office within 3 days of receiving it. The wrongful conviction application took another 4 months to work through the courts. I was still in Drumheller for most of that process. My criminal lawyer visited me twice during that period and kept me informed. She was careful never to promise an outcome. She told me the evidence was strong. She told me to be patient. Patient. After everything that had already happened, patient. But I was. Because I had learned something about patience in Drumheller that I hadn't known before. When you have no control over your circumstances, none, zero, absolute zero, you discover that patience stops being a virtue and becomes something more like a survival skill. You practice it the way you practice breathing. You don't do it because it feels good. You do it because the alternative is coming apart, and coming apart in that place would not have served me. The conviction was quashed on a Thursday in October. My criminal lawyer called the institution and I was released within 48 hours. Standard procedure had me processed out on a Saturday morning, which is how I ended up standing at that gate in minus 18 degrees with a garbage bag and mud-caked boots. Miles drove 4 hours from Fort McMurray to pick me up. He stood by his truck in the parking lot outside the gate, and when I walked toward him, he didn't say anything for a moment. He just put his arms around me. My older son, who was not a demonstrative person, who would rather fix something than talk about it. He held on for a long time, and I felt him shake slightly, just once, and then he let go and he said, "Let's get you home," and we got in the truck. We drove most of the way in near silence. Good silence. The kind you can only have with someone you've known your whole life. Evan and Tanya had been arrested 4 days before my release. The RCMP had moved on the basis of the forensic accounting evidence Miles had produced, combined with additional investigation that had uncovered emails between Tanya and the law firm she had apparently engaged to help structure the secondary banking access. The handwriting examiner's report on Carol's note had been reviewed by the Provincial Fraud Unit and incorporated into a broader fraud and forgery investigation. They were charged with fraud over $5,000, forgery, and obstruction of justice. I did not feel what I expected to feel when Miles told me in the truck. I had spent 17 months imagining this moment, in the way that incarcerated people sometimes build a mental sanctuary around the idea of justice. Not as comfort exactly, but as something to orient toward. I thought I would feel vindicated. I thought I would feel triumphant. The word revenge had lived in my mind for so long that it had started to feel like a destination. What I actually felt was tired. A bone-deep cellular exhaustion that had nothing to do with sleep. And then, underneath that, something I hadn't expected: grief. Not for Evan as he was now, for Evan as he had been at 12 years old, playing goal in our driveway on a Saturday morning, falling down on the asphalt and getting up and asking me to shoot again, wearing a mask 2 sizes too big that kept tipping forward over his eyes. For the person he had been before whatever happened inside him that made him capable of this. I don't know when that shift occurred. I've thought about it more times than I can count, and I don't have an answer. Maybe it was Tanya's influence, gradual and cumulative. Maybe something in Evan had always been there, dormant, and I'd missed it, the way you miss a crack in a foundation until the wall starts moving. Maybe it was both. Maybe the answer doesn't matter as much as I keep telling myself it does. The civil litigation around Carol's estate was resolved the following spring. With the forgery finding and the criminal charges against Evan, the handwritten note was thrown out entirely. The estate was distributed according to Carol's actual will. Miles and I each received our share. Evan's portion went into trust pending the outcome of his criminal proceedings. I did not contest that arrangement. My civil lawyer asked me if I wanted to pursue additional damages, and I said no. I had already paid enough in legal fees to rebuild a small house. I didn't want to spend another 2 years in courtrooms. I sold my house in Lethbridge. The firm was gone and the house held too much, not just of Carol, but of the version of my life that no longer existed. I moved to a smaller place in the Okanagan, a 2-bedroom house in Oliver, British Columbia, with a yard that backs onto a vineyard and a view of the hills that turns gold in September. It is a quiet place. I am learning at 63 to let quiet be enough. I got a call from the Alberta Court of King's Bench about 6 months after my release. A formal letter followed. The Crown offered a written acknowledgement of the wrongful conviction. A statement of regret. My criminal lawyer told me I had grounds for a civil claim against the Crown for wrongful prosecution, a process that exists under Canadian law, though it is slow and the outcomes are uncertain. I told her I needed time to think about it. I'm still thinking. What I know is this. The justice system failed me profoundly, And then it corrected itself. I am not sure those two facts cancel each other out. The 17 months cannot be given back. The firm cannot be reassembled. The relationships with former employees, with clients I'd had for 20 years, with community members who saw my name in the local paper and drew their own conclusions, those are mostly gone, and I don't expect them to return. But I am standing in a yard in Oliver, British Columbia, watching the frost come off the vineyard in the morning, and I am alive, and I am free, and I am myself. Nelson and I talk on the phone every few weeks. He's back working, doing electrical inspections and some consulting, rebuilding his own life the way people do, quietly, without ceremony, one day at a time. He asked me once if I'd forgiven Evan. I told him I didn't know. He said that was probably the most honest answer available, and that he respected it. Miles came out to visit in July. We sat on the back porch for 3 evenings in a row and talked more than we had talked in 20 years combined. He told me things about his own life I hadn't known. I told him things about Drumheller I hadn't told anyone. It wasn't comfortable exactly, but it was real, and real is something I have come to value more than comfort. As for Evan and Tanya, their case is still working through the courts. I won't know the outcome for some time. My lawyer sends updates and I read them and then I put them in a folder and go outside. There is a retriever mix that belongs to my neighbor 2 doors down who has decided, unilaterally, that I am her person. She comes to my fence every morning and waits until I come out to scratch her ears. She doesn't ask anything of me. She doesn't need anything explained. She just shows up, and I show up, and that is the whole transaction. Some mornings that's enough. Some mornings that's everything. I keep coming back to one image. Not the courtroom, not the gated Drumheller, not even Miles standing by his truck in the parking lot. I keep coming back to Evan at 12 years old, falling on the driveway asphalt with that too big goalie mask, tipping over his eyes and asking me to shoot again. That kid didn't disappear overnight. Whatever he became gradually. Through choices that accumulated over years the way debt does, quietly and then all at once. I've had a lot of time to think about that. And what I've come to understand is that the choices we make when no one is watching are not separate from who we are. They are exactly who we are. Evan made his choices in the dark, behind access profiles and numbered companies and a forged signature on a page that was supposed to carry his mother's wishes. He thought the darkness would hold. It didn't. That's not justice in any grand or cosmic sense. It's just consequence. The things we do leave traces in bank metadata, in handwriting pressure patterns, in the memories of people who knew us before we became something smaller than we could have been. You cannot permanently build your life on something false. The structure will show the fault eventually. It always does. What I learned about myself in those 17 months is harder to talk about because it isn't a clean lesson. I didn't emerge from Drumheller with clarity and purpose. I emerged exhausted and diminished and, in certain ways, permanently changed. But I also emerged with something I hadn't fully had before. An honest understanding of what I'm actually made of when everything external is stripped away. There is a kind of intelligence that has nothing to do with credentials or professional reputation. It's the ability to read people with care, to notice when something doesn't add up, to protect what matters before it needs protecting. I was not as sharp as I should have been. I trusted because it was easier than questioning. I left Evan's signing authority on that account because addressing it required an uncomfortable conversation, and I put that conversation off for 4 years. That negligence didn't make me guilty of anything criminal, but it made me responsible, in a quieter way, for leaving a door open that should have been closed. And then there's what Miles did. My older son, who never announced himself or made speeches, who simply decided that the truth was worth finding and went and found it, at considerable personal cost without asking for recognition. That is what genuine strength looks like to me now, not the dramatic gesture. The quiet, sustained effort, the decision to keep going when there's no guarantee it will work because it's the right thing to do regardless. Nelson taught me something related. He showed up and played cribbage and didn't require anything from me except my presence at the table. That consistency, small, repeated, without fanfare, was more sustaining than any single act of heroism could have been. Integrity, I've come to think, is mostly made of small things done reliably over time. Evan forgot that, or never believed it. Miles and Nelson lived it without ever naming it. I don't know what I would tell the 61-year-old version of myself standing in his office after those RCMP officers left. Maybe nothing. Maybe there are some things you can only learn by going through them. What I know now, at 63, standing in the yard in Oliver watching frost lift off a vineyard, is that the life on the other side of the worst thing that ever happened to you is still your life. It can still be worth living. It can still, on a quiet morning with a neighbor's dog at the fence, feel like enough.